under your butt.
Da-da-da. Oh, hello. Welcome to episode 136 of the Civil War Breakfast Club podcast. Once again, I'm joined by Mary, a woman who is also short, angry, and likes to burn things. I am merely a blackened marshmallow named Darren. Smoke 'em if you got 'em, Mary. How we doing?
What? I am not angry. I am short.
No, not you. No, you're not angry. You like to burn things, I'll tell you what.
I'm not like Sherman. I shouldn't say
Anyway.
that. Actually, the guy we're going to talk about in this episode, a little bit worse than Sherman.
A little bit. So how are you doing today? It's been a couple weeks since we recorded. We're settling in the new digs, Mary. We're getting wound up and getting ready to go. So how are you doing?
I'm good. I'm settling into life here in Pennsylvania, which is nice. How about you?
It's good. It's quite different, not going to lie, but it's good. I like it. It's very, very good. So I'm going to be a gracious host to you today. And of course, I'll ask you that question, of course, Marianne. What are you drinking today?
I am drinking Tall Hat Imperial IPA by 21st Amendment Brewery. Judging by your response, you have the same one. And I'm drinking it out of my Gettysburg mug.
Okay.
What are you drinking and what?
Oh, my
mug?
God. Thanks for asking. I thought you forgot about me, Mary. I'm drinking, it's called Top Hat IPA from 21st Century, and I'm drinking it out of my Run with the Winner mug, which is what it is right here, because we're going to run with the winners today. And we're going to run, and we're going to run away from the winners, Mary. So we got a lot of fun stuff to talk about, Mary. Tonight, we're going to head back into the Shenandoah Valley, and we will just be discussing the Valley Boys, for sure. That's what we're going to be talking about. What will begin basically as a campaign to drive the Confederates out of the valley and cut off their food supply will result in an event that is still talked about today, and that is called the burning. No, Mary, this burning is not the sensation A.P. Hill had when he peed, Mary. Don't confuse the two, okay?
I was hoping there was an A.P. Hill joke in there somewhere.
It is about a wide level of destruction, rarely ever seen in American history, but one that is very understudied today. It was an event driven by revenge and personal loss that resulted in the destruction of millions of dollars in property near Dalton and Harrisonburg, Virginia, and left a scar on the whole region that is still felt today. Now, again, we'll talk about the Valley. Now, during the Civil War, the Shenandoah Valley was the breadbasket of the Confederacy that was so crucial to Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia to feed his army in the East. For 3 years, keeping the Valley in Confederate hands was of utmost importance to Lee, considering that Union blockade of those Confederate seaports was prohibiting those desperately needed supplies from reaching his men. So he had to hold the Valley at all costs. 1862, Mary, there's a guy, his name was Stonewall Jackson. Perhaps you've heard of him, okay? He controlled it, but after he died in 1863, it kind of remained unchallenged until 1864, when focus once again went to the Shenandoah Valley. Now, on the Union side, the generals in charge who were trying to take this valley was a cavalcade of clowns, as they say, sadly including my fellow Waltham, Massachusetts resident, the great Nathaniel Banks. But in 1860...
And former 11th Corps Commander Franz Sigel is involved as well.
We'll get to him. We will. But in 1863, while things were falling apart in the West, Vicksburg fell, the Confederacy was cut in half, everything was going badly. In the East, Lee is going to try to hold it together, and supplies were always the front of his mind. Don't you forget, Mary, the Gettysburg Campaign, which was really just a large shopping trip where he acquired enough supplies to sustain his army for the rest of 1863, for example. It was always on his mind, right? Though it's still knowing the importance of the Valley for the most part in 1863, it really wasn't threatened by Union forces for the most part. But on March 10th, 1864, everything changed. You know what happened on March 10th, 1864?
I'm trying.
Well, on that date, Abraham Lincoln, the guy on the cam, okay, he signed a rather brief yet important document promoting one Ulysses S. Grant to command all armies, and he became a lieutenant general of the United States Army. Now, Grant's promotion and subsequent transfer to that Eastern theater will change everything in the East, and his focus now was doing whatever it took to destroy Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. It became paramount. Now, again, think about it for a second here, Mary. By 1864, the Civil War was costing the federal government $1 million a day to feed and supply his armies. I looked it up on the Google machine, Mary. In today's dollars, it equals a whopping $20,050,700.64 per day to feed his troops. That's a lot of DQ blizzards. That's a whole bunch right there, right? That's a ton, but the North had the money. Mm-hmm. The South, not so much. They were always trying to find a way to feed the Southern soldiers, and it was always a struggle. The daily ration for a Southern soldier in 1864, a quarter pound of bacon and a pint of cornmeal. That's it. That's all they got. That was it, right? To this end, Grant knew that starving Lee's army was the key to defeating him. It made controlling the valley a priority for Grant once he arrived in the East. So you can see how this whole thing is going. Yeah. Destroying the food supply, that Confederate breadbasket, is going to mean a change in strategy and a change in philosophy. We were talking about a little while ago, in overall warfare. And it began a concept of total war, which dominated for the most part 1864.
Yeah, in 1864. So we saw like 1861, 62, 63. You have more of what could be, because I don't know if this is the correct term, but the gentleman's kind of war. You line up, you fight kind of thing. The total war, or the hard war, which Sheridan is going to do in the Valley and which Sherman is going to do on his march to the sea in November of 1864, is more of a psychological warfare. So this actually began early in 1864 with Sherman and his Meridian campaign. Now we did an episode about this, but in short, you can think of the Meridian campaign as being a very small scale on the march to the sea. And it was kind of the precursor. This was what gave Sherman, I think, the idea to do the march to the sea on a much larger scale than what he had done in the Meridian campaign. The Meridian campaign, Sherman's troops had wrecked railways, they'd terrorized citizens, destroyed property, cleared out the guerrillas, and lived off the land. And as I said, it's a sort of test run for the March to the Sea. And so this March to the Sea, the burning of the Shenandoah, are examples of hard war that are going to differ from previous years of the war, because this is bringing the war to the people. And both Sheridan, I'm sure we'll discuss the quotes too, and when we do the episode about the March to the Sea, we'll discuss what Sherman has to say about this too. But this is, kind of this psychological, that if you are fighting in Virginia and you're fighting with Robert E. Lee in the Army of Northern Virginia, and you've got your wife and your children are living back in the Valley, and someone's going and terrorizing down there, you're going to stop thinking, because now your property is at risk. Now your family is at risk, and you might desert. You might not have your mind into fighting, and it's psychological warfare, and it's a harder style of war. And like Lincoln, Grant, and Sheridan and Sherman are all starting to see that this is going to be the path to peace. And it starts this change from not going after Grant is still going to go after the Army of Northern Virginia, but now you're starting to go after kind of the citizens and the property as well. Right. So it's changing.
Right. It's a change in goal. I mean, like you just said, instead of targeting officers and soldiers, it meant destroying farms, livestock, anything that they could be seen as something that Confederates could use to sustain their armies in the field. And like you said, it also had the extra effect of maybe bringing some soldiers back home to protect their families. Now, this overland campaign of Grant is going underway. Lee is pinned down in Petersburg. And this is when Grant finds that new target to test this new style of total war. And this was, like we said, Lee's food source in the Shenandoah Valley. So by spring of 1864, the valley becomes a focal point in the East again, which is going to lead to a handful of initial battles. Now, we're not going to go into real details about the battles in the valley, because we want to get some things later, because they will set up some things later on. But the aforementioned Union commander at the time, like you just said, was one Franz Sigel, right? Who on May 15th, 1864, despite having 50% more men, inexplicably was defeated by John C. Breckinridge at the Battle of New Market.
And that's really something when you're getting defeated by Breckinridge. And as I've said about Sigel before, he was best left with the artillery.
Yeah, he was. But this was the Field of Lost Shoes battle. So if you've seen the movie, this was that battle. Well, so once again, bad leadership on the Union side stopped their effort in the Valley cold. Again, that was a recurring thing. A week later, Sigel gets dumped of Wiedersehen. He's gone and dumped in favor of David Hunter. Now, when Hunter was put in command, this is the first time Grant issues that total war strategy order. So as he's moving up the valley, he began to burn civilian properties per Grant orders. He didn't do a lot of it, but he did enough to earn the nickname Black Dave. That's the nickname he had because that's what it was. But unfortunately for the Union, Black Dave was almost as incompetent as Siegel or Banks was back in 1862. Meanwhile, back in Petersburg, Robert E. Lee, he's getting reports of this new enhanced effort by Grant to control the valley. So he's going to make a change too. He's going to put a man in charge who he trusts, General Jubal Early is going to be put here. Now, Early, he was no Jackson Mary. I mean, he was like you. He was profane. He chewed tobacco. He swore a lot. I mean, my God, you might be reincarnated.
Post-Civil War, he has the connection to Canada because that's where he goes to live post-Civil War.
Goes. But the thing about Early, though, he was a hard fighter, and he commanded Lee's Second Corps, which sounds like a lot, but it's really about the size of a division. He's got around 15,000 men, give or take. But here's the thing, though. Lee had zero respect for the Union Army in the Valley. Why? Based on previous generals who they had placed there. And he felt comfortable. Don't forget, he's in Petersburg. He's pinned in by Grant and this Leviathan monster of an army surrounding him. He has so little confidence in the Union of the Valley, he's going to send those 15,000 people over, along with Richard Anderson's division and Joseph Kershaw's division. They're going to send them along back to the Valley. So that's how much he had no respect for the Union in the Valley, right? And it didn't take long for Lee's opinion to prove correct here. Because on June 17th, Early, despite having less men, he's going to defeat Hunter's army at the Battle of Lynchburg. And Early's Second Corps, they fought hard, and Early himself was relentless like he always is. But basically, to that point, Lee realized that Early was kind of pretty much allowed to run free in the valley to do what the hell he wanted because no one was going to be able to stop him. So he gets that idea. I need to get some troops away from Petersburg. Why don't you go take a run at Baltimore or Washington just for the hell of it and see if you can pull some troops out? This, of course, will result in the battles of Monocacy and Fort Stevens, July of 1864. But even though Early failed to invade the capital, it embarrassed Lincoln on the eve of that re-election bid and caused havoc on Wall Street to the point where the U.S. dollar fell to 39 cents, the lowest at any point during the war, all because of Early's unexpected raid, which came this close to succeeding, right?
But thanks to Lew Wallace at Monocacy, who provides the speed bump for that. But also, too, that's another thing to keep in mind with 1864. The other thing, too, is the election. That is a big deal. And I'm sure that does factor into this kind of switch to this hard war to end it quicker as well.
It does. But here's the thing, though. After this near disaster in Washington, Grant is done screwing with Early. So on August 1st, 1864, he says, you know what? This Jubal Early needs to be stopped for good. We're done messing around. We're done. For this to happen, Grant is going to need to consolidate troops from the Army of Western Virginia in that middle division that's guarding Washington to form this Army of the Shenandoah. And he needs a commander who he trusted to go ahead and command it. The general he handpicked to command this new army was a man he knew very well from the West who he trusted, named General Philip Henry Sheridan, a man with a lifelong hot temper. The media called him Ducklegs. That was his nickname.
Oh, my God.
Okay. But also he was called Little Phil because he was 5'5". Mm-hmm. But he's graduated 34 of 52 in the West Point class of 1853. You know who he went to school with in 1853?
That would have been
John Bell Hood, James Burbsy McPherson, and of course the Gallant John Bowen.
Oh, there's our Bowen.
Class, right?
Gallant Bowen.
But it's funny, but in West Point, and we're going to talk a lot about his background, but at West Point, Sheridan's temper got the best of him a lot. Mm-hmm. He got in a fight on the parade grounds at West Point, and he threatened to bayonet a fellow cadet. He was suspended for a full year because of his, quote, poor attitude. No, right?
Not Sheridan.
But he was a soldier through and through, and he was inspired by war. So when the Civil War broke out, he rose quickly. And we talked about his success he had at Stones River, helping break the line at Missionary Ridge in Chattanooga, as well as later in the Valley campaign that we're not going to talk about today because we did an episode on it, Mary. On Cedar Creek, right? Sheridan was a trusted fighter and a leader for Grant, and he was the needed go-to guy in the Valley. And when he needed one, Sheridan was the guy, without a doubt. When Grant gave Sheridan his orders, he said to him, quote, "Go get Early out of the valley and follow him to the death."
Mm-hmm.
He also reminded him to follow that new total war philosophy and burn anything he could that was of use to the Confederacy. Again, Grant's quote to Sherman, "The valley should never again be a resource to Lee's army. Crows flying over for the balance of the season will have to carry their provender."
Yeah,
that's what he says. Okay.
Yeah. So basically, it's just this whole idea to wreck the valley.
It was, and we're going to talk about the bigger part of this later, which is the primary episode of the story over here. But for Lincoln, Sheridan's success was also important because what you talked about was because Grant was stalemated at Petersburg. Mm-hmm. He desperately needed victories to help cement his reelection hopes, right? So Sheridan's new Army of the Shenandoah had close to 40,000 men, made up of 4 military departments, and was ready to move up the valley. Now, for the most part, the valley was controlled by Confederate cavalry at this point, specifically the cavalry commanded by the great John Singleton Mosby, Mary, the Gray Ghost, right? Mosby's partisan rangers dominated the valley for most of the war, and they caused a cramp in the crotch to any federal unit that was in it.
Yeah,
what they did.
And they are really, like, I'm reading a Mosby biography right now, and his whole thing was like, he's not some bloody Bill Anderson. He will capture people and let them go. He's just there to do this psychological thing, get in their heads, but he's letting people go. It's not like, I'm not condoning what he did, but he's not a cold-blooded murderer at all. He's just wreaking havoc. He's burning supply trains. He's spanking Stoughton at one point when he captures him, and just basically and we did an episode on Mosby. Like, his thing is like his men could gather, they could do their thing and then disappear. And that's why he's called the Gray Ghost.
Yep. And he was a nuisance. He wasn't someone who was, who was going to, like you said, wasn't a murderer. He wasn't a killer to the point of some of these other people that, bushwhackers, and we'll hint on that a little bit too. But he was a pain in the butt for the Union. Mosby considered the valley his personal property, his domain. And when federal troops were in it, just like the Michael Jordan meme, he took that personally.
Yeah.
That's kind of what he did. By now, the overall man in charge of keeping the valley in the hands of the Confederacy, though, was Early, right? Sheridan and his army began moving up the valley. We say up, I mean north to south. That's what we say. And immediately started to look for weaknesses in Early's army, also burning farmlands slowly as they progressed. That was the secondary goal. The primary goal was finding Early and destroying him. But he wanted to make sure he kept Grant's total war strategy in his mind, too, and he focused on burning anything that it would benefit the Confederate cause, just like he said. August 13th, 1864, Mosby's Rangers are going to destroy Sheridan's supply wagons in the town of Berryville, Virginia, which resulted in the destruction of almost all Sheridan's food. He almost lost it all, right? This raid is called the Berryville Train Raid, or the Battle of Berryville Pike if you're nasty, right? But it caused Sheridan to fall back towards Charlestown. And it really got the ire of people in Washington, because here we go again. We got another guy in the valley who was promised who's going to do all these things, and he gets hit and he fallbacks yet again. Lincoln feared Sheridan was going to be another failed general in the valley, and much to his delight, felt the happiness about this news that he received from Mosby. Early said right after this Berryville raid, Sheridan is a quote, "Sheridan is just another weak general in the valley. He is without enterprise and possessed with excessive caution, which amounted to timidity."
Timidity. I can't say it.
Timid.
He's timid.
He's timid. Okay. Tough word to read. People talk different back then, Mary. But Sheridan, to his credit, he blew off this criticism. He was getting on both sides, and he began to formulate his new move. Now, he knew Early, was aggressive, and it wouldn't be long until he took the initiative. This is Early. It would attack Sheridan's army. So what Little Phil wanted was to bait him and draw out Early to destroy him. That's what he wanted. Sheridan's army, like I said, was concentrated near Charlestown, which is now West Virginia. John Brown, where he was hanging, that's where we're talking, just outside of Harper's Ferry. Now, Early, predictably, he fell for Sheridan's trap, and on August 21st, when Early, along with General Richard Anderson, launched an attack at a place called Cameron's Depot. Now, the fight wasn't really a large one, But it's important because it forced Sheridan's men to fall back again. But that next day, Early is going to move to attack Sheridan again, this time directly in Charlestown, which caused him to retreat again into the entrenchments of a place called Halltown, which is just south of Harper's Ferry. So a couple days later, August 25th, two divisions of Sheridan's cavalry are going to intercept Early's advance. But after the rebel infantry pushed them back, Sheridan what? He knows Early's intentions now. He knew Early had a smaller army. He knew he was in the open, and he knew he was on the move.
Yep.
So he basically was a rope. He was rope-a-doping him is what he was doing to basically give Early a little false confidence. But more importantly, he's sick of dealing with Mosby. He wants to fight mano a mano with somebody.
Mosby's in his head, and he's got a quote, like, and I'm sure we'll get to this, but basically, like, he just wanted the men started to, like, basically, it's time to hang them if they keep doing it. Mosby is in his head.
But here's the thing: Early is no. He didn't wake up last night, Mary.
No.
Early, to his credit, because he knew his army was divided, but he also sniffed out Sheridan's plan. He's like, you know something? He's trying to draw me out. So what does he do? He's going to basically fall back himself and not attack again. So this game of cat and mouse is going to continue, and Early was fantastic in anticipating your opponent's move, is what he did. That's why Monocacy is so strange, because he did not expect that.
No,
but this one, he's like, wait a second, this Sheridan's got 40,000 guys. Mm-hmm. This is too easy. He's trying to bring me in so he can, and then he's like, nope, I'm back, and that's what he does. So by early September, Early is thinking what his next plans are. This is when he gets some bad news, and it wasn't from the Federals. You know, it was from Lee.
Yeah.
And it was basically he got a telegram that basically said, hey, I gave you Richard Anderson's division and I gave you Joseph Kershaw's division. Gonna need him back. So you're gonna just send those guys back to me as soon as possible. And what happened was, he basically decided that Early, had them long enough. It's time to go back. Now both these divisions are going to start to go back, and this is where you kind of get lucky. On their way back to Petersburg, they're going to run into George Crook's 8th Corps from the Army of Western Virginia, who chased the Confederates back to Winchester, Virginia. Mm-hmm. And so Early, who wasn't far away, says, you know something? I'm going to Winchester because now I can consolidate my army again. I didn't tell them not to come back. They couldn't make it back. So I got them, right? So for the first couple weeks of September, Early and Sheridan were close. They were right on the outskirts of Winchester. And each sent cavalry patrols out to reconnoiter each other. But for the most part, they just sat around and stared at each other for a couple weeks.
Just going to
stare. They didn't do anything. Finally, September 16th, Sheridan gets the information that Joseph Kershaw's division did officially vacate the dance floor. They left, and he returned to Petersburg, cutting Early's army now down to less than 14,000 men. 40,000, 14. Which one would you rather have?
Yeah. I think the bigger army.
Size matters, Mary.
Even though I don't like Sheridan.
Right? No, but it does. Sheridan could not believe his good luck, and he wanted to attack as fast as he possibly could. But what does Early do? He jumps on him again. He pulls the rug out. You know what Early does? Even though he's down 2-to-1 manpower at least, now that Kershaw's gone, he still assumes Sheridan sucks. And he's just as bad as Sigel. He's just as bad as Banks. He's just as bad as Hunter. So he makes the decision, just like Robert E. Lee did at Chancellorsville, to divide his army in the face of the enemy. He is going to take 2 divisions, 10,000 men on September 17th, and move them out of Winchester, leaving about 4,000 men in town to defend against 40,000 Union soldiers. What he wanted to do is he wanted to go around the Savannah and attack the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which was Sheridan's main supply hub. So that's what he's thinking. Again, he's thinking same thing. Get the supplies, cut them off. But almost immediately, Sheridan is going to find out from his cavalry about Early's move and decides it's time to attack. So he sniffs this out now too, this cat and mouse game. And he goes, you know something? It's 4,000 guys. Leroy Jenkins, we're going in. We're going to destroy the small Confederate front. And his plan was he was going to hit both of the rebel flanks in Winchester at the same time. Now, Early's smaller force in Winchester, they were screwed. They were doomed, and they needed a miracle to happen for them, or they were going to get absolutely destroyed. So guess what happens, Mary?
A battle? No.
They get the miracle.
Yep.
They do. September 18th. Early is going to find a telegraph message about a meeting that took place the day before between Grant and Sherman, who met personally in Winchester.
You mean Sheridan?
Sheridan, sorry. I'm the first time I've done that. Grant and Sheridan in Winchester, okay? If you find out that the guy who you're facing is meeting face-to-face with the big man, the boss, what do you think is going to happen?
Something big
right?
is going to, like,
they're planning something. They're planning something big. So Early, he wisely realized that if Grant was meeting personally with Sheridan, that an attack on his men was imminent. And so he turned and hauled those two divisions' hindquarters back to Winchester as fast as possible. So Early and those 10,000 men, they're going to arrive back in Winchester mere hours before Sheridan's all-out attack that was planned for the next day at dawn on September 19th. But dawn comes the next day, nothing happens. Orders get screwed up, the Federals get bogged down, and it delays the attack for hours. Early's going to use that time to basically place his men now in front of Winchester to defend themselves against this. Noontime, finally, Sheridan was ready to attack, and he followed through on his plan to hit those both flanks, like I mentioned. This battle is going to be known as the Third Battle of Winchester.
Yeah.
Now, again, we're going to do an episode on this. It's a cool battle. We're not going to talk too much about it. But real quick, Reader's Digest version, the Rebs are going to discover a gap on the Union line, which they're going to charge through, causing the Feds to run like hell. During this charge, one of Early's top generals, General Robert Rhodes, will be mortally wounded in this attack from Gettysburg here. A Union division under the command of David Russell from Salem, New York. He was part of Horatio Wright's 6th Corps. He was in reserve. He's going to attack the rebels once they get within about 200 yards of his line. And this Union counterattack is going to help restore the Union line. Russell himself is going to be killed in this assault. Emory Upton's going to take over. If you've ever read Elijah Hunt Rhodes' diary, All for the Union, he was part of this counterattack. He was part of the 2nd Rhode Island and Oliver Edwards Brigade. And he talks about it in detail, so check it out. But in the end, Early was forced to retreat, and Sheridan will be victorious at 3rd Winchester, also known as the Battle of Opequon Creek.
Yep.
Okay.
It's very hard fighting, though, for several hours, and it's going to start a series of losses for Early's army, and it's going to be the largest and costliest battle, or one of the largest and costliest battles that is fought in the Shenandoah Valley. The total casualties, Union and Confederate combined, are 9,000. So it is a significant battle when you think about it. And as you said, we are going to do an episode about it because it's quite an interesting study in itself.
It's not 9,000 casualties. For one, it's the last battle in Winchester. Yeah. But 4,000 of those casualties belong to Early, which was 26% of his army he lost in this battle. Okay, that's a lot. Okay, Early was humiliated at 3rd Winchester. After the battle, he wrote, because he was allowed to escape, he took off. Custer chased him down, but they got away. Early wrote, Sheridan should be cashiered for allowing us to escape, because he thought that was it. Mm-hmm. You know who was thrilled about the battle, Mary? General Grant. Loved it. 4 stars. He reviewed.
Well,
it,
yeah,
right?
it looks good in the media if you're having a victory, especially in terms of an election. And this is what they wanted, was they wanted fighting to happen.
It does. When he got news, so he's back in Petersburg now, Grant is. He's sitting in his tent. He gets the news of the victory at the Battle of 3rd Winchester. Reportedly, he went outside and in true Mary Tyler Moore style, threw his hat in the air in celebration. Probably had a shot of whiskey too, just saying. But so he was very, very thrilled. Now, Early is going to fall back to a strong defensive position 22 miles south of Winchester called Fisher's Hill. And by the next morning, he had set up defenses and was going to wait for Sheridan. Now, on September 22nd, Sheridan, who had followed Early, bluffed a frontal assault on Fisher's Hill, causing Early's men to withdraw, while he snuck George Crook's 8th Corps, the one who bagged those 2 divisions, around Early's flank and attacked. I mean, not a huge battle. 1,000 Rebs were captured as they ran away, and this is going to be called, of course, the Battle of Fisher's Hill. Yeah. And Sheridan was prepared to bag early for good. But again, unfortunately for Sheridan, for whatever reason, his cavalry stopped chasing early and they escaped again. But with each battle, Early was being pushed further and further out of the valley. Now, during this march up the valley, Sheridan, like we said, had continued to burn materials per Grant's orders, but he did so orderly and transactionally.
But then things start to get personal, and that starts
right. Well, it does, and the thing but just to set up before we get to set up how the situation here is now. He's doing it's part of his job. I'm going to burn this farm. I'm going to burn this, but because I have to, and he's following the boss's orders. Early moving south now, there was really no Confederates to stop Sheridan, right? So it was primarily back to those Confederate cavalry raiders and organized bushwhackers, independents, who basically were formed to harass Sheridan's supplies and communication networks. According to a Richmond newspaper, they wrote, "Our guerrillas and irregular bands in the valley have completely cut Sheridan's communications from Winchester." Right. So again, that's the whole thing. The whole thing is a headache to go ahead and try to stop him. Right. Now, and this was the environment in early October of 1864 that event that you hinted at happened that completely changed Sheridan's mindset.
But there's a couple of them. It begins on there's one that happens on September 23rd. That results in Mosby's Rangers attack a Union ambulance outside Front Royal. Wesley Merritt and his first cavalry come to the train's rescue, and Mosby's guys try to escape, and a Union lieutenant, Charles McMaster, he tries to stop them, and he ends up getting shot, riddled with bullets, and trampled by horses. And when his body was found, it was concluded he was killed after he surrendered. This is what Wesley Merritt concludes. And in retribution for this, 4 of Mosby's Rangers are shot, and 2 other are hung on a hill overlooking Front Royal with a placard draped over them which reads, "This will be the fate of Mosby and his men." So this is one of those incidents leading up to it, and I know you've got one to talk about that is probably it's a little bit more significant than this one with McMaster, but this is still, it's one of those things that it's just grinding away at what is going to happen with the burning in October.
Right. The thing about the McMaster thing was Mosby was uniformed soldiers. They were cavalry, but they were Confederates. They were not independents. Okay. So what will happen is the thing we hinted at before is Sheridan's mindset's going to totally change, and he's going to make this campaign extremely personal. The result of this incident is going to be called the burning. And when it was over 450 barns and 30 houses were burned to the ground by Sheridan's vengeful, angry men. In the end, everything William T. Sherman is accused of doing in Georgia in today's historical memory was actually done by Phil Sheridan. Okay. That area today, the land running south of Raleigh Springs Turnpike, south of the North River, if you know the area, to this date is still called the Burn District. That's how bad this thing was. So what happened? Early October, those rebel cavalry patrols we were talking about, who were still going through, Early's back, so now there's just the cavalry again. They're going to be sent towards Sheridan's lines to gather information for Early in preparation for hopefully a renewed attack around the town of Harrisonburg, Virginia. They're scoping, they're probing, they're trying to find out what he has. They've had a bad example over at 3rd Winchester, lost 1,000 more at Fisher's Hill. They're down men. They're trying to see if there's a way they can find a way to do something. On Monday, October 3rd, 1864, a small group of rebel scouts is going to cross the North River in a drizzling rain like we've had here for the last forever. That miserable gray rain that never seems to go away. And they're going to cross the river, and they're going to sneak up some federal camps just to see what's going on. At the same time, a young lieutenant by the name of John Rogers Meigs, along with 2 orderlies, were out early that day making the rounds of the camps to map out the locations of each brigade. So if Sheridan needed to move, he knew where his brigades were. They would go out, here's this brigade. So this way he has a map, he knows where everybody is. If we need to attack, this is what Meigs did. This was his job along with those orderlies. Now, background real quick. John Rogers Meigs, J.R. Meigs, was born on February 9th, 1842 in Washington. the eldest son of 7 children of Brigadier General and Union Quartermaster Montgomery Meigs.
Mm-hmm.
Also the grandson of John Rogers, a naval hero in the War of 1812. That was where he got his name. John was the apple of Montgomery's eye. He was the favorite son. 1856, age 14, he enrolls at Columbian College in Washington, which is now known as George Washington University, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
But he wanted a military career like his father and his grandfather. So in 1858, he is going to apply to West Point, and his application was supported by the former Secretary of War, a guy named Jefferson Davis. That's who supported him. But Mary, there's a problem. There's always a problem.
Yep.
Davis was the former Secretary of War. You know who the current Secretary of War was? John B. Floyd, the man who later, when he led his Confederate men in those trenches at Fort Donelson and took off.
Oh, he went like zip.
U.S. Grant openly called him a traitor. And you know what John B. Floyd does? He blocks John Meigs' admissions to West Point. He blocks it. You know why? Because he hated his father, Montgomery. Hated him.
Wow.
So he stood in the way. So what happens? In September of 1859, President James Buchanan, personally helped admit John to West Point, and he finally enrolled in the class of 1863. Here's the thing, though. John R. Meigs was a genius. He was brilliant. He was just one of those people. He excelled in math, excelled in science. He thought at a different level. While at West Point, the Civil War is going to begin, and he takes a military internship, and he joins Henry Hunt's 2nd U.S. Artillery Company M, which is part of Irvin McDowell's Army of Northern Virginia. He's basically an aide to Israel Richardson, who commanded the 4th Brigade of 2nd Michigan, right? That's who that was. And he's basically carrying orders in his observer. He's kind of, runs orders. That's all he does. He's president at First Bull Run, and Richardson loved him. He just knew his stuff. He knew exactly how to deliver the orders in the conduct of battle. He'd never lost his head. But after the battle, Montgomery's like, I don't think I want my son out there. I'm going to bring him back. So your internship, kid, is over. You're going back to West Point. And so that's what he does. Back at school, John focused on his academics, but he found himself in trouble in May of 1862. He was insulted by a cadet on the parade grounds. Again, just like
Sheridan.
What the hell's going on in those parade grounds, Mary? Everyone's getting angry, right?
Yeah.
He gets in a fight with the cadet so bad that both men end up in the hospital. They beat the hell out of each other. Meigs is going to get suspended and confined to campus, where he'll basically is told you're going to be an assistant math professor and you're going to teach a class on land surveying.
Wow.
But so that's kind of his punishment.
So he didn't get completely ousted like Armistead.
No. He, despite earning 74 demerits, including one for, quote, obnoxiously slurping his soup, he got a demerit for that. He graduated first in his class at West Point, the class of 1863. Obnoxiously slurping his soup. That's literally how the demerit reads. Can you imagine?
That's I was just thinking back to we went to the round table about Sherman, the talk about Sherman last week at the Gettysburg round table. And I know the guy said number of demerits, but it was enough that Sherman did not graduate first in his class.
Yeah. But if you remember from that thing we went to, when you finish first in your class at West Point,
you get to
pick, and the plum job is engineering.
Yeah.
So he'll be made a first lieutenant of engineers, and he worked in Baltimore, Harpers Ferry, and Cumberland, Maryland. His job there was basically to make sure the telegraphs and roads on the Baltimore-Ohio Railroad stay opened. And he had that task in July of 1863 when Lee's army retreated from Gettysburg. He was the one who maintained the road networks. That's who he was. On November 3rd, 1863, Meigs is going to be named the chief engineer of the Shenandoah Valley under David Hunter. So this is how he comes into the valley. When Sheridan replaced Hunter, he kept Meigs on, and he loved working with him. He called Meigs the best map maker in the Union Army.
Yep, and he was Sheridan's favorite subordinate. They had almost like a father-son relationship, and Sheridan at the time did not have any children.
Yeah. 22 years old, by the way. Just think about that, right?
Wow.
Sheridan took a shine to young Meigs, and Meigs taught Sheridan all the layout of all the ridges, the roads, the hills, all through the valley. He sat down and said, here's where you need to go. He was his right-hand man on getting his army through the valley. That's who John R. Meigs was. So again, By October 64, Meigs is going to be named a brevet major after his work directing the troops in the army to get to Fisher's Hill. But so jump ahead to our story here. Meigs is out with those two orderlies now, and they're making their rounds on that rainy day on October 3rd, 1864.
160 years ago today, as we are recording this.
It is, okay. Their last stop that day was around dusk in a mile north of the town of Dayton, Virginia. Now, it was raining, and they're on their way back to headquarters, and they entered the Swift Run Gap Road, which runs over some hills towards the Valley Pike, but they needed to go back. As they rode, they were about 100 yards from a junction when they approached some woods, and out of the woods rode those three horsemen, those three Confederate scouts wearing raincoats. Again, it was rainy. They were wearing raincoats. They were not wearing uniforms. They were wearing raincoats. The three men turned away from Meigs, like, just keep going. Don't make a scene. Let's get out of here. And Meigs begins to follow them at a slow trot, and finally he orders the three men to halt. The three men, they slip into a single file, but they keep moving as if they didn't hear him. They just keep going. Those three men Meigs encountered were Confederate scouts from Colonel Williams Wickham's brigade, who were sent there, like I said earlier, to gather information about the position of the Federal troops in that area. The leader of this group, his name was Benjamin Frank Shaver of the 1st Virginia. His family lived right around the corner, so he was put in charge of this, even though they're from a different regiment, because he knew the area. The two other guys were George Martin and F.M. Campbell, who was Wickham's chief scout, and they were from the 4th Virginia Cavalry. So you've got Shaver from the 1st, leading Martin and Campbell from the 4th, and that's what they're doing. Now, Shaver had hoped to stop at his house and see his parents on the mission, because that was why he went, but he made it clear at the beginning of the mission, this is a recon job. If we see anybody, we're not killing anybody. We're getting in, we're getting out. He made it very, very clear. And that's kind of in the back of these guys' minds. So these three men were on their way to Shaver's family home when they ran into Meigs and those two orderlies. So Meg yells out, "Halt!" Campbell whispers to Shaver, "Shall we run or shall we fight?" And Shaver shakes his head and goes, "We have to fight." So Campbell then ordered the three horsemen to widen the gap from each other to allow them to wheel around and to attack if necessary. Each of the Rebs, meanwhile, discreetly pulled out the revolvers and hid them in their raincoats. When Meigs rode up behind them, the Rebs all turned to their horses, pulled out the revolvers, and demanded Meigs to surrender. Meigs didn't surrender. He pulled his revolver out and fired, hitting Martin in the groin. Had to be Martin's worst Monday ever. Rainy days and Mondays, Mary, right? As Martin slumped in the saddle, he was able to fire his weapon, and a quick firefight happened among these men. During this fight, Shaver reportedly now aimed his revolver at Meigs' head and fired, as Campbell also fired at Meigs at his body. Meigs was hit in the head and hit in the chest, killing him instantly. He fell off of his horse, while one of those two orderlies jumped on his horse and ran like hell and got away. The other surrendered. Martin, the Confederate who got shot with a bullet in the old coin purse, he asked the two rebel companions to get him away from the Federal lines, and those four men, including their new prisoner, because they caught one of Meigs' guys, galloped down the road past the Federal picket line into the woods, and they vanished into the night. They dropped off the wounded Martin at the home of a guy named Robert Wright, and they fled back to the camp of the 1st Virginia Cavalry. Now, the next morning, one of Sheridan's aides, a guy named George Forsyth, is going to come upon the dead body of John R. Meigs, who was fully stretched out with one arm partially raised and the other arm at his side.
Oh, so rigor mortis is set in.
Right. And they noticed he had a bullet hole under his right eye, as well as another one on his left side of his chest. Forsyth had no idea who killed Meigs, and he speculated it was either one of Mosby's men, but it was more likely by one of those independent bushwhackers, one of those non-soldiers, okay? John R. Meigs was dead, and nobody knew who killed him. It was likely the first time anyone ever wondered who shot JR, realistically speaking.
That's awesome. Right? I love the Dallas reference.
But when the news of Meigs' death got back to Sheridan, Sheridan went into a rage and completely lost it.
Those around Sheridan, so angry.
Those who knew Sheridan's temper were even surprised how mad he was. He was seeing red, murderous rage when he found out Meigs was killed. He'd been dealing with these bushwhackers and Mosby's guys, like you said, since August. And now one of them killed one of his favorite young officers.
Yep.
That orderly I mentioned who jumped on his horse and escaped, he reported that they were attacked by 3 civilian bushwhackers wearing non-uniforms. They were wearing coats. He was talking about the raincoats.
Yep.
And Meigs was murdered in cold blood when he demanded their surrender. This orderly also told Sheridan that Meigs' last words were, "Please don't shoot me."
Yeah. And that's and that's probably what gets Sheridan going. And Sheridan vowed to teach a lesson to these abettors of the foul deed, a lesson they would soon never forget.
He considered Meigs' death not an act of war, but cold-blooded murder. Mm-hmm. And in his official report, he wrote, "Lieutenant J.R. Meigs, my engineering officer, was murdered beyond Harrisonburg near Dayton. Since I came into the valley from Harper's Ferry, every train, every small party, and every straggler has been bushwhacked by these people. The chaplain of the 10th Vermont, a guy named Edwin M. Haynes." This is the chaplain now. This is what he writes about the situation. "The people were meek-faced during the day in the presence of a considerable body of Union troops. But once darkness came, they became bloodthirsty guerrillas, and in this character, they stole upon our men like savages and shot them down. There were some hung by their heels with their throats cut. Could any punishment be too severe?" So Sheridan now, he's got these orders to burn stuff that could benefit the rebels. Now it turns into a revenge for Meigs' death. He orders the entire town of Dayton completely burned to the ground. Burn everything.
Yeah.
You know what? He summoned George Custer, who was kind of his guy, to his headquarters in a place called the Birdhouse, BYRD, right? And personally handed him the orders to burn everything. Custer got the orders, jumped on his horse, turned away and laughed and yelled to Sheridan, "Look out for the smoke." That's what Custer said as he took off. These people, they were mad. This was a real deal. Custer ordered his men to burn every building within a circle of 3 miles around the scene of Meigs' murder. The men of Custer's 5th New York were ordered to burn Dayton, while the 116th Ohio had the task to bum the town. I mean, go ahead and steal what you can. Yeah. But here's the thing. A lot of the soldiers, they'd been in this area for a couple of days, for a little while. They got to know the inhabitants. So they were like, man, like they want us to burn. So we orders, we have to do it. But the burning was going to take place the night of October 4th. Mm-hmm. So they spent the day of October 4th knocking on doors, warning the families of what's about to happen. They told them, gather all your stuff, get it out of here as soon as possible, because tonight everything's getting burned. Some soldiers, these are Union soldiers now, actually helped the Virginia families move their items out of harm's way and placed troops in front of the houses to guard from bombers planning to rob it first. So you can see the conflict these guys have. Yeah. And this is war when you're thinking about it, right? There are several stories from families describing their experience during the burning. And they tell stories of real misery, but also unexpected Northern kindness too. It's a contradictory thing.
Well, there's a few Northern soldiers. There's one I'll talk about in a little while. His last name is Kidd. That he's very affected by this, the burning, and you can tell they didn't all agree with it. And that tells me that Sheridan was kind of starting to go over the line with it. That this was beyond what needed to be done.
He did, because they were burning barns, they were burning furnaces, they were burning factories, anything that was going to help the Confederate effort, anything like that, burning mills. But now they want to burn houses where widows live, and they want to burn places where kids live. Yeah. An Ohio soldier, he wrote, and I quote, "Such mourning, such crying and pleading for mercy, I never saw nor want to see again. Such wild, crazy, mad, some crying for help while others would throw their arms around Yankee soldiers' necks and imploring for mercy." A Union cavalry, a member in Custer's division, he wrote to his wife, "In the town of Dayton, everything was carried out of the houses and left out until morning. Soldiers carried off whatever they had their mind to. He's talking about the bummers, right? People in the area quickly saw the town engulfed in flames as the 5th New York began to burn the houses and barns. One of the first houses targeted was the farm of Noah and Sarah Wenger, who lived about 50 yards away from where Meggs was killed. So they were starting at the location, working away from what they were doing. The Wengers were able to get most of their belongings onto a wagon and joined a refugee wagon train that was slowly going down the Valley Pike away from their homes that were about to be burned. Before long, the 5th New York had torched most of Dayton, and the smoke was seen in every direction. Some horsemen arrived at the house of Reuben Swope, who begged him not to burn the house where it stood. His wife Susanna and his 3 children in stunned silence were there as they began to burn the property right in front of them. One of the soldiers, and this is an interesting quote, one of the soldiers asked one of the children, a daughter named Susan, if she thought that women of the valley would ever forgive the Northern soldiers for burning their homes. And she replied to them, do you think if Southern soldiers were burning the houses of your mothers and sisters, they would be forgiven? Right?
Yep. Good question. So, okay, touche.
Right, exactly.
Yep.
It's like this blue locust storm was visiting every farm in the 3 miles between Dayton and Bridgewater. There's a story about a woman there who was 64 years old. Her name was Abigail Kaufman. And she's sitting on her porch, 64 years old. And these soldiers are going to approach her house. And she tells them, you can't burn my house. I am first cousins with your boss. And they go, our boss? You mean Custer? She goes, no, Lincoln. It was Lincoln's cousin.
Oh, my God.
Right? But you know what happens? The men's like, well, orders are orders. So they're going to burn the house. They go into the house to go and look for stuff they're going to take. And they go and find her husband Joseph's Masonic apron. And then they immediately left and made sure the house remained standing.
Wow.
While Kaufman's neighbors' houses were burning, right? So it wasn't the Lincoln relative that saved the house. It was the Freemasonry thing. Yeah. Similarly, up the street, the soldiers entered the home occupied by the family of a guy named Valentine Bolton, who was away fighting in some regiment somewhere. When the burning party arrived, they found Valentine's wife, Mary, and her 3 children, and they were told, vacate the property, we're burning your home. When the men entered the house, as the children screamed and cried, just imagine.
Yeah.
One of the soldiers emerged holding Valentine Bolton's Masonic manual. The soldier asked the wife, is your husband a Mason? And she says, yes. And the soldier turned to the men and said, this house is not to be burned. Let's go. And then the house was stayed. Wow. So it's these stories that keep coming up. Now, Sheridan, he was having obviously a very tough time, but he made a deal with the churches. He says, I'm going to burn your church, but if you're a clergy, I'm going to give you a 6-mule team and a wagon to help move your belongings out of the house, out of here. But, a guy named David Landis, he was a Mennonite. He took advantage of this offer and began to load up his belongings. And Landis wrote that when he returned after the Union troops left, he saw his home, his barn, and all the outbuildings were completely burned to the ground. He wrote, the Union Army came up the valley, sweeping everything before them like a hurricane. There was nothing left for man or beast, from the horse down to the chicken. All were taken. But a lot of the religious people saw the fire shooting in the sky like a meteor. They thought it was Judgment Day. Yeah, that's how bad this thing was. Literally, they did, right? Mm-hmm. These people outside of Dayton who saw the glow of the fire, all they could do was sit back and wait their turn.
Yep.
Just imagine, right? To this point, the burnings were done by the cavalry. The 116th was doing the bombing, the 5th. Sheridan felt it was taking too much time. You guys are going too slow. So he's going to enlist the infantry to do this now too, to speed this thing up, because he wants to get going with this. This is one of my favorite stories. I'm just going to lie. This is one of my favorite stories. One of the first farms that the infantry visited was the farm of Jacob and Margaret Byerly. And they had watched in horror these last few hours, watching their neighbors' homes being torched and ransacked by federal troops and stealing their animals, because they were taking all the animals too. The Byerly's oldest daughter, a 17-year-old girl named Martha Jane, she owned a musical instrument called a concertina. You know what that is?
Is it like piano thing or something?
It's like an organ.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, those things that the circus, the monkey plays.
Yeah.
Right? I don't know. Is that what that is? But it's one of those things. I Googled it to see what it was, and it looks like an accordion, which must have sounded horrible, right? Anyway, the Byerlys were staunch slave-owning secessionists who saw the war as their real hope for independence. As the infantry troops approached the house to round up all the livestock, and they prepared the torches to burn the house, as they told the Byerlys of their intention, we're going to burn everything. Just better GTFO here. You better go, right? Jacob Byerly begged the troops to spare the house, and for whatever reason, they actually did. But they said, fine, but we're going to burn your barn and your outbuildings, and we're going to take all your animals. But we're going to spare your home. Martha Jane, the 17-year-old with the concertina, she watched as the men stole the animals, including a duck that she considered her pet.
Aww.
And she ran out with the concertina in her hand, begging the men to spare her duck. The soldier had the duck in his hand, and he sees the girl with the instrument. She's only 17, she's a kid, with the instrument in her hands, and he says, you know what? You play me a tune, and I'll give you your duck back. Martha's got the tears rolling on her face. You can only imagine. So she plays a tune. You know what song she plays?
Dixie, your Bonnie Blue Flag.
She plays Dixie, right? And the soldiers stand there glaring at her, but they also, you know what? They start laughing. And they just start laughing. So you know what? After a couple of moments of stunned silence, they give her the duck back and they leave. They thought it was hilarious, the balls that the girl had. I'm going to guess her parents wish they took the concertina, because I bet you that sounds horrible. Just saying. But they let her keep it.
But they got the duck.
But you know, she got the duck back, so she's 2 for 2. Okay. But stories like this happened throughout the region, as families hurried to protect their possessions while those troops prepared to burn their homes, and there was nothing they could do about it. There were reports that Phil Sheridan himself sat in a wagon with his feet up, cigar in his mouth, watching everything burn, for the revenge of J.R. Meigs. Yep. Just sitting back, enjoying, loving the moment.
Well, Sheridan's philosophy, too, was that the loss of property would weigh much heavily with the people in the valley, than even more than the sacrifices that were being made on the battlefield too. That was his philosophy. But yes, as you said, he has made this so personal because Meigs was like a son to him. And he's also riled up too because of Mosby. Mosby is in his head, like the same way that Nathan Bedford Forrest was in William T. Sherman's head. It's the same thing.
But I mean, there's another story. Morgan Sellers, his wife Julia, and their children moved to the area down the Valley Pike near Lacey Spring soon after Virginia seceded. Morgan, the husband, joined the 7th Virginia Cavalry, and when he was wounded in April of 1864, he went home to recuperate, and he deserted it, right? That was it. He's going to stay home, eventually join a bushwhacking unit commanded by a guy named Al Lincoln, of all people. His wife Julia was home when the burning party showed up. Her 2 children were dying of typhoid at the time these men arrived. The soldiers took the children, put them under a tree, and getting ready to burn the house. According to stories later told by locals, this is hearsay, this isn't from them, Mrs. Sellers saw General Sheridan, of all people, out in the road and begged him to spare the house for the sake of her 2 dying children. Sheridan empathized and said, okay, I tell you what I will do. I'm going to spare the home, but I'm taking all your food. So he took all the chickens, took everything, but he left their house. So, I mean, you know, it is what it is. The infantry marched. They trampled through yards, gardens, cut down telephone lines, telegraph lines. They chopped up telegraph poles. What surprised many of the locals at the time was the lack of Southern troops to stop this. There was nothing they could do about it.
It's kind of like what you're going to see on the March to the Sea. There's no one coming to stop them.
And not far away was cavalry under Lunsford Lomax, a Newport, Rhode Island-born guy who chose to fight the Confederacy, who was in this area trying to stop a cavalry brigade of Michiganders under the guy you mentioned earlier, James Harvey Kidd. That's all they had. They captured about 20 of the burners, but overall, they could do nothing to stop them. And when it was all said and done, the Confederate infantry did finally show up when the Union fell back, what they called a smoky trail of desolation. and they were stunned at what the federal troops had done to the valley. I mean, that whole area, what they did was it was completely destroyed. Henry Kidd Douglas, an aide to early staff who rode with Stonewall Jackson, who they said was the most handsome man in the Confederacy, by the way, Henry Kidd Douglas, right?
Wow.
He wrote, I'm going to read a quote by him. He wrote, "Columns of smoke which almost shut out the sun by day. I saw mothers and maidens tearing their hair and shrieking to heaven in their fright and despair, and little children, voiceless and tearless, their pitiable terror." He also wrote, "Seeing the daughter of a clergyman who was seen laughing wildly, having gone mad at the sight of her family's outbuildings and home in flames." Now, when the Union troops did leave Rockingham County, the officers in the county court appointed a committee to assess the destruction within this jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm.
The final list of the burning was published in November of 1864. I'm going to read you this list. 30 homes burned, 450 barns burned, 31 mills burned, 10,000 bushels of wheat carried off, 50,000 bushels of corn destroyed, 7 DQs burned, 1,750 cattle carried off, 1,750 horses stolen, 4,500 sheep stolen, 3,350 hogs stolen, 3 factories and 1 furnace burned, not to mention the countless of displaced clowns who lost the woodlots. I mean, who knows whatever happened to them, right? But the devastation, but the devastation was so brutal that even northern newspapers couldn't believe how bad it was. They had there was a correspondent who was traveling with Sheridan, and on October 6th he wrote in his newspaper, and he pull up right here. He wrote, this is what appeared in the paper: "The poor, alike with the rich, have suffered. Some have lost their all. The wailings of women and children, mingling with crackling of flames, have sounded from scores of dwellings. I have seen mothers weeping over the loss of what was necessity to their children's lives. The last bit of flour stolen by stragglers, the last morsel that they had in the world to eat and drink stolen. Young girls with flushed cheeks or pale with tearless eyes have pleaded with cursed the men whom the necessities of war have forced them to burn their buildings, reared by their fathers, and turn them into paupers in one day. The completeness of the desolation is awful." Now, when darkness fell on October 6th, a couple days later, Sheridan's infantry went into camps that stretched out for about 6 miles. Sheridan himself rode back to Newmarket, where he made his headquarters for the night, feeling basically his men had done very, very well in this burning. Now, the thing about, like we said earlier with this, right, is the burning of the valley is something that does not get enough study.
No.
As much as the smaller burnings done in Georgia by Sherman. They dominate the imaginations of people who study the war for whatever reason. But in the end, the destruction caused by Sheridan's men in the burnt district was the best example of U.S. Grant's total war strategy in war, brought on to a maniacal level by Philip Sheridan, caused by the death of a close aide and close friend.
Yep.
He took his orders and injected it with steroids because he was pissed at personal loss, and that's what the burning is.
Yeah, and he's not supervised during this at all. Like, Grant is like, whatever, do your thing, right? He doesn't realize the destruction that Sheridan is causing. Sheridan was described by one person as the most savage man I ever saw. And the 6th Michigan Cavalry Major James Kidd, who you had mentioned earlier, he is a Union guy, and there are many of them that really are affected by what has happened here, affected negatively, because they're kind of like, wow, this is way more than what we should be doing. So Kidd had got a flour mill up and running for his men so they could have food, they could take the flour with them. And it was ordered to be burned, and Kidd tried to stop it. And he wrote, "The wheels were not stopped, but the torch was applied, and the crackling of the flames intermingled with the rumbling of stones made a mournful requiem." And he said that he witnessed women and children pleading with soldiers for flour before the mills were burned, and they often received none. Kidd also said women and children in their arms stood up in the street and gazed frantically upon the threatened ruin of their homes while tears rained down their cheeks. And this is something that kid said that he would never forget, that it was forever. And whether, he meant this or not, it was burned in his memory, was one of the stories I read from him. Custer apparently shot a man who was developmentally disabled. And the guy that witnessed it said to him, "You will sleep in a bloody grave for this." So there are, there's some pretty horrific stuff going on here that does not get talked about a lot. And then Mrs. Hugh Lee of Winchester, she wrote, "Sheridan, Sheridan, what demon of destruction has possessed you? God grant that you may meet with a righteous compensation." Like, so she's like, they see this guy as a demon. But this is what Sheridan wanted too. He wanted to bring this war to them because he said, they're sitting here, they're not experiencing the war. Let's bring the war to them. And he wrote Grant at one point and he said, "I think they're getting sick of war here. I think they're getting sick of war." And it just, like, it's one of those things, as you said, that it's not talked about enough. And as I said, like Colonel James Kidd, the one of the Union soldiers, he said, "It's burned in my memory. The anguish pictured in their faces would have melted any heart not to be seared by the horrors and necessities." And he has quotes around necessities of war. "It was too much for me, and at the first moment that duty would permit, I hurried from this scene." So he's trying to escape from doing this. And that's the thing, these are not the same stories that you hear on the March to the Sea from the soldiers. This is a very, very different situation. And keep in mind, yes, the Civil War needed to be brought to an end, but Sheridan in the Valley takes this up another notch to a very personal level.
Yeah, we're not saying that Sherman didn't do it, because he did a lot of things in Georgia.
Oh, he did. There was bad stuff done in Georgia too.
But nothing to the extent of Sheridan in the Valley. And you can go to the burnt district today. You can go down there and visit, and you'll see signs of the burnt district, and you see the size of the area that was burnt. Just imagine. I mean, and the thing about it, though, you look at this thing. War is hell. It's a terrible thing.
Yep.
And you look at when it's taken to civilians at a personal level, and you can picture the women holding their children, crying as their houses are burned, their husbands are dead, or they're gone, or they're fighting somewhere, and they're left with nothing. What are they going to do? Their lives are completely destroyed. That's what this was. That's what this was. Yeah. So it's, like I said, for whatever reason, it's not something that's at the historical front of mind. But when you read the Valley, you tend to think of Stonewall Jackson. You start thinking things like that. But when you look at the real Valley, when you start to look at the end state Valley, the horrors, and you can see the evolution of the war. By the time you get to October, September of 1864, and you see what happened to the Shenandoah Valley, designed to starve out the Confederate soldiers to end the war. It's real war. It's total war. Yeah. And it's something that's amazing that something like that could happen on American soil when it's Americans against Americans, but it happens. And you can read the Elijah Rhodes diary we talked about, some other things that they talk about with this to get a real good flavor to put yourself in the situation. Put yourself in the shoes of these people. What would you do if you're a Union soldier? What do you do? You have to take orders. Yeah. What do you do? What do you do if you're a clergyman? You're in the South, even if you're a loyalist, and you've got to get your personal belongings out of your house because it's about to be burned. You didn't do anything wrong, but again, this is what war became, and that's what it was. So it's an important study. I'm glad we did it, but I think it's one that requires a lot of different study by a lot of different people. But it goes to show the mentality of someone like Philip Sheridan and the impact of a guy like J.R. Meigs's death and what it did to him. Yeah. Because it literally flipped a switch in his head. That was a very bad place to go, and that's what happened.
Yep, and he took it up a notch. And, yes, we have the quotes from Sherman regarding Atlanta saying, like, this is war. This is what it's like. And these people, they basically, like, what they did, this is what we're going to do back to them. But, again, the Valley it does not get talked about enough. Everybody focuses on the March to the Sea, which is still a very important part of the Civil War. And yes, there are brutalities that happen on it as well. But the burning is where a lot of the stuff that you hear about Sherman in Georgia, it is what Sheridan did in the Valley.
It certainly does. All right. So what's coming up for us next, Mary? What's next for us?
So next, we are probably going to be recording our Halloween episode soon with Jen Price will be
we'll be doing one before Halloween, though. That's a month away.
I'm sure we will. Yes, I'm sure we will. But I'm just saying that the Halloween episode is coming up with Jen Price. We will be sharing ghost stories and just doing a little Halloweeny episode like we did. I think it's our
don't make them too scary, Price.
Yep.
I gotta sleep at night, Now let's forget. Rumor has it, Mary, that there's a round table coming up soon, allegedly.
Yep, there will be a round table coming up soon. We are going to do, just as we did an episode on the burning in the valley, which the 160th anniversary is pretty much upon us. We are going to be doing an episode about Sherman's March to the Sea and kind of the logistics that go into that. And just, I think, when the burning happens in the valley, Sherman has not yet had his plan approved for the March to the Sea. He actually writes Oliver Otis Howard, there's our Howard reference, a letter on October 1st and basically says, keep this to yourself, but this is what I'm planning. And he says it's going to be, kind of more large scale than what he did in February, referencing the Meridian campaign and all that. So he still does not have buy-in yet from Grant and Lincoln to do this March to the Sea. Yet it's about 6 weeks after the burning that the March to the Sea happens.
That's a fascinating part of history. So any final words from you, Finchero?
Well, thank you for bringing it like you always do. Thank you to our listeners for being here for these 136 episodes. We really appreciate all the support that, you guys give us. We wouldn't be here without you.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we'll have a great rest of the weekends coming upon us, Mary. I don't know if you know this, but it's finally stopped raining. So we can actually go outside today. So the sun is out. It's clear anyway. So we're going to go out and enjoy the rest of the day. So have a great weekend. Stay safe. Hope your football team loses. If you don't like the Patriots, but I don't care anymore. Who cares? Hey, your Cleveland Guardians, Mary. Your tribe playing well.
They are going into the playoffs. Yay! They're going to be playing the Detroit Tigers. So,
and little did I realize that the Orioles, they call themselves the O's because that's how many wins they got again in this playoff season, Mary. It's so weird how life imitates art as usual. In any case, that's tough, but it is what it is. All right, guys.
You know what? Either way, I just want the Yankees not to be in the World Series.
Oh, yeah. I'm telling you, they won't. They'll choke as usual. Anyway, off we go. Everyone have a great rest of the weekend. We'll talk to you all on the other side.
See y'all later. Bye.